Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
Fallout as a franchise has been around for over 2 decades at this point, and is one of my favourite video games of all time. Released first in 1997, the franchise has since developed into something of an icon within the video game community. Its mascots, the Pip-Boy and the Power Armor, are extremely recognisable, even by people who don't play much video games. Seriously, it has infiltrated every corner of the normie sphere, with internet memes and even an Amazon TV adaptation. The name Fallout stands for its setting. A retro-futuristic take on 1950s America, full of Cold War paranoia, patriotism, and technological optimism. The world-building of the series is very interesting, openly inspired by the fruits of American capitalism, such as not Coca-Cola, not Walmart, not General Motors, among several others. Unfortunately for the people of this setting, their fears would come true, as in the year of 2077, the world descended into a full-scale nuclear war, reducing America into rubble. Vault-Tec is a massive corporation that capitalized on the public fears of impending nuclear apocalypse and built several bunkers around the USA. They advertised that these bunkers would house the people that sign up for it, protecting them until the outside world is safe again.
Our American way of life. Isn't it grand? Peace, freedom, and bacon and eggs. Seems perfect. But what if it's not? Friends, your future may not be as secure as you think. Where will you be when the atomic bombs fall? You can secure your family's future by reserving a spot in a state-of-the-art underground vault from Vault-Tec. That's right, Bob. Act now, and your family can wait out the horrors of nuclear devastation. And Doris, the vault will have all the amenities of your modern-day home, and it's attractive. And Sally, in the vault, you might meet that special someone, just as you would on the surface. And in a few short years, you and your fellow vault dwellers will repopulate our great country. And Billy, you'll have lots of swell kids to play with. Reserve your family spot in a state-of-the-art underground vault today. Sign up now and prepare for the future.
If you've already played the video games or have watched the TV show, you'd know that this was definitely not true, and that Vault-Tec was openly lying to the public. Only a few of these walls that Vault-Tec deemed as the control group were actual nuclear bunkers. Instead, Vault-Tec was using these walls to recruit for a large-scale scientific study. They were in cahoots with the American government, who knew full well that the Earth will never be habitable again if there is to be a global nuclear apocalypse. They wanted to conduct human experiments along with Vault-Tec to study survival in very extreme situations in hopes of informing their space program. They wanted to use the people from the control walls and colonize outer space. Given the conditions that Vault-Tec was studying inside some of these walls, I really do not think they would have had much luck with colonizing outer space, and they would have probably just led to mass extinction. This is because in some of these experiments there seems to have been very little scientific thought, and it's really hard to understand what exactly Vault-Tec was studying in these experiments. For example, Vault 77 had only one man with a crate full of puppets, and the company was trying to induce aggression using white noise and subliminal messaging in Vault 92. And in Vault 75, they were trying to carry out a eugenics program, infusing different organisms with humans. I genuinely don't know what they were thinking there. Well, a lot of these walls look at far-fetched research questions that don't seem to be applicable to the real world. Some walls do have interesting implicable findings. For instance, Vault 95 was an experiment where the company tried rehabilitation for substance addicts, and upon completion of their rehabilitation, they would be presented with a secret stash. The Vault also comes with a really amazing storyline, and is probably one of the strongest points of Fallout 4, a game that is notoriously known for being terrible. Vault 11 comes from the game Fallout New Vegas, and it takes a real-world experiment and gives a Fallout twist to it. Because I'll be discussing this vault extensively, please do note that there will be spoilers for the video game Fallout New Vegas. Vault 11 was built by Vault-Tec to study obedience. The company wanted to see if people would still obey authority figures and follow authoritarian rules, even if they personally disagreed with what they were told to do so. Vault 11 was rumoured to have about 1,000 residents, along with an overseer. The overseer is basically the vault manager who was a Vault-Tec employee. However, the overseer also was unaware of the experiment being conducted. After the vault was sealed in 2077, the vault computer then informed all the residents, including the overseer, that they would have to choose one of their fellow residents to sacrifice by the end of each year. If they failed to choose a sacrifice, they would all be exterminated. The residents of Vault 11 then decided that a democratic system would be the most appropriate for selecting the person to sacrifice, and then they ended up selecting the overseer as their first sacrifice. The person who was chosen for sacrifice would then have to walk through a long hallway through to the sacrificial chamber. Inside the chamber, they are then asked to sit in a chair and shown a debrief presentation before they're finally exterminated. Based on watching the debrief video, it's clear that Vault-Tec had no regard for the human lives and the human suffering that was carried out during these experiments. They were only interested in the data and had zero empathy for the participants. The moment the presentation ends, the person sitting in the chair is met with a rain of machine gun fire from a bunch of drones stationed around the chair that are hidden conveniently until the presentation ends. It's crazy as to how much firepower Vault-Tec has packed.
Greetings, martyr, and welcome. If you're here now, it means you've been offered up as a sacrifice so that your vault can continue to thrive. Currently, you may be feeling sad or angry. Perhaps you never got to have grandkids, or to enjoy the pleasures of a fresh cigar. But march with your chin held high, soldier, and remember that each of us has an important role to play. For some people, their role might be to heal the sick. For others, it might mean they will drive a race car or fly a rocket ship. And some of us are meant to forfeit our lives for the good of the people. Sure, it might not be as fun as driving a race car, but it's every bit as important. Let's take a moment to reflect on the moments that made your life worth living. Think about that time you kissed your steady girl for the first time under the bleachers at the big game. Or when you snuck out after curfew to catch that new flick that your parents wouldn't let you see because it was too scary. Boy, were they right. And who could forget when you met the love of your life? What a looker. These are just examples. Do you feel that feeling stirring in your chest as you think of these things? Good. What you are feeling is peace. You've led a great life. Living it has been its own reward. But it is only the beginning. Close your eyes now and imagine what joys await you in the next life. The afterlife. Can you see them? Good.
The research paradigm and the question inside Vault 11 was very much inspired by a real-world psychological experiment. While this is not officially confirmed by the developers or by Bethesda, it's clear that they were very much inspired by Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram is a famous psychologist from the late 50s who's well known for conducting a lot of obedience experiments. Similar to Vault-Tec, although Milgram was quite tame with his research methods, he lied to the participants of his study by telling them that he's investigating whether giving electric shocks to people would improve their learning. In reality, Milgram wanted to understand whether people would give electric shocks to other people just because they were asked to do so. The study was set up in such a way that there are always two participants within the experimental room, a learner and a teacher, along with the research staff member. The learner was trapped to a device that would give them an electric shock whenever the teacher presses a button. However, the learner was actually a decoy and was a member of Milgram's team. And this learner would act as if they were in pain from the shock every time the teaching participant presses the button. The teaching participant was instructed to give the learner an electric shock each time they made a mistake. And whenever the teaching staff was reluctant, the research staff member would gently encourage them to continue the experiment. While no electric shocks were actually given during the course of the study, the results of the study showed that most participants were okay with increasing the level of electric shock up to a lethal level when given the instruction by a research staff member, who in this experiment was literally just a guy in a lab coat with no scientific expertise. Milgram repeated similar trials several times over the next few years and concluded that people can be obedient to authority figures even if it would mean that they would cause harm to another innocent human being. It's almost hard to believe that Vault-Tec did not intend for anybody to be sacrificed within Vault 11, especially considering the fact that they built an entire sacrificial chamber just for that purpose. However, in reality, very similar to the Milgram study, Vault-Tec was not intending to sacrifice anybody, and the right response that they were looking for from this experiment was for the individuals to come together and say that they do not want to sacrifice their fellow peers. I mean, looks like a surefire way to study obedience, right? Vault-Tec took a real-world experiment, followed the procedure to the T, developed a very similar research protocol, coming up with a similar but more drastic question. Yeah, no. The biggest problem with Vault 11 is the fact that the experiment it's based upon is fundamentally very flawed. Neither Milgram nor Vault 11 were actually investigating real obedience. In fact, they were looking at a different variable known as coerced obedience. Coerced obedience is when people follow instructions or orders from authority figures only because they have no other option to do so, or they've been influenced into obeying the authority figure, not out of own volition. And if we look at Vault 11, the residents in this vault had no choice but to obey the authority figure. Most people, if not all of us, have experienced some form of disaster safety training, be it in the form of earthquake safety, fire safety, or if you're American, odds are you've probably had some form of firearm response training from your high school. And in all such scenarios, you are urged to obey the response guidelines without question. There is no way any resident would have even thought about disputing whatever Vault-Tec had told them to do. And even if someone did, they probably would have been selected for sacrifice by the majority, as most people would just rather blindly follow guidelines during emergencies. This is a fundamental research design flaw, and scientifically speaking, Vault-Tec should have tried to account for this factor. However, it's clear that Milgram also did not account for this factor, as critics argue that because the authority figure from that experiment was presented to the participants as a member of the research team, the participants in their perceptions would have no choice but to follow through with any instruction given to them by the research team member in order to progress the study. They would be under the impression that if they don't follow through, the study would stop and that they would have not completed their job as a participant. Critics argue that this factor really influences the participants to be more obedient to the authority figure within that context. Despite its flaws, and despite the fact that the Milgram studies were actually investigating coerced obedience, the studies do hold a lot of relevance to modern literature and social psychology. This is because future studies have proven that even without any coercion elements, people do tend to obey authority figures even if they disagree with them morally. In Fallout's canon, the bombs went off in the year 2077. Everyone who signed up to Vault-Tec from the Mojave area were rushed into Vault 11. As people were rushing into the vault, they all started to subconsciously identify with each other as a Vault 11 resident. They all really believe that they are in there to wait out the nuclear apocalypse, and because everyone else is in the same boat, it sort of fostered a sense of belonging. This feeling of belongingness amongst a new group of people can be explained by a psychological theory called social identity theory, a theory which helps us understand how people operate in groups. The way Vault 11 residents started to resonate with each other as they were entering into the vault is known as social categorization. The theory explains that we as humans have this automatic process in our brains where we tend to classify people into groups based on some visible shared characteristics. This could be things like gender, or age, or profession, or in Vault 11's case, collectively surviving a nuclear apocalypse. And we do this in order to understand the social world. The residents of Vault 11 also immediately identified the overseer as a Vault-Tec employee and excluded him from this new group, demonstrating another example of social categorization. The next step in group formation, according to the theory, is social identification, which also we can see unfold in Vault 11. This is when we as individuals start to define our values and worth based on a membership to a social group. This also results in seeing other groups of having different values, which could potentially lead to conflict, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. This directly feeds into the next step of group formation, which is social comparison, where we start comparing our own groups against the other groups. In Vault 11, especially after the Vault computer had informed the residents that they would have to sacrifice a fellow individual, it was relatively easy for the residents to categorize the Overseer as a potential member of the outgroup, especially given that he was a Vault-Tec employee and that they would probably view him as semi-liable for Vault-Tec demanding them to sacrifice. This allowed for the residents to directly categorize the Overseer as a threat to their safety and rationally choose him as their first sacrifice, so that they can pretty much live guilt-free for another year until they have to choose another sacrifice again. Researchers argue that the tendency to want to join groups is innate to people. This is normally called as the need to belong, as we all sort of have a predisposition to form and maintain strong positive relationships with other people. The initial big group of all Vault 11 residents broke apart over time, with the rise of several smaller subgroups with different values. While the core values of these groups were not explicitly stated in the game, we can sort of see that they do drastically differ based on their names and the styles of propaganda they use. One of the reasons why several groups broke out could be due to the possibility that once the Overseer was out of the picture, the people in the vaults needed to find reasons to sacrifice a fellow resident with minimal guilt, because no single human would want to be responsible for the death of another human. If we were to look at it from a utilitarian perspective, we can argue that people derive individual benefits from joining groups. The social exchange theory argues that relationships tend to take an exchange process, which can be both material and psychological. For example, joining a union could potentially help a wage worker fight for better benefits, or joining a faction in New Vegas would give you discounts from the vendors of said faction, or in the case of Vault 11, they could be sharing blame. It's easier for people to make this decision while belonging in a group because it allows for them to share the responsibility. A resident could be thinking along the lines of, I'm not the only person wanting to sacrifice this other person, everyone else is. Moreover, while in groups, there's also a likelihood that the residents could engage in action via inaction, in the sense that an individual could be effectively responsible for the sacrifice of someone else, but only because they did not play an active part in stopping it, and by allowing the other group members to make this difficult decision for them. This refers to as social loathing, which basically refers to when you're in a situation that demands action, but you are reluctant to do it, hoping for someone else to do it. For example, say you're in a class and the lecturer is asking the entirety of the class a question, but you do know the answer, but you are reluctant to share it because you are terrified of being wrong. Therefore, you wait for someone else to answer. I do think, however, even though different subgroups emerged in the Vault, there is still some semblance of a shared identity around the overarching Vault group. We can see this in the form of some common values that they try to play upon to influence the voting process. After the first sacrifice, the residents split up into 6 smaller groups of unequal sizes in order to protect themselves from getting voted upon. However, due to the inconsistencies around the numbers in each group, one group ended up gaining a lot of power over time. But I'm once again getting a bit ahead of myself here. The groups were actively competing against each other in order to avoid one of their members getting voted for sacrifice, and the way they did that was very in line with the social identity theory. This is because the theory firstly explains the exact process of a competition between an in-group, a preferred group that the individual is a part of, and an out-group, an undesirable group that the individual is not a part of. The authors describe that within the social identity theory, groups tend to exaggerate the differences between each other, while also exaggerating the similarities among people within either group. For example, if you love League of Legends, and if you play League of Legends all the time, odds are you would probably be revalidated constantly about your own community, and you would perceive the community of a different game, say Counter-Strike, as more toxic than yours. And for Counter-Strike fans, it would be the opposite, where they would perceive League of Legends players as more toxic than themselves. Honestly, in my opinion, I do not like the community of either game, but I chose it as an example. We tend to engage in this differentiation because it helps to strengthen the feeling of closeness within our own group. This results in us comparing ourselves favorably to the outgroup. However, too much of this closeness is not good. Oftentimes, members of groups tend to reinforce and reiterate shared similar values through social comparison or arguments that are very persuasive and not necessarily critically evaluating the stance of the outgroup. This results in members taking more extreme or even radical decisions. The process is known as group polarization, and it paves the way for something called groupthink to happen within the group. Groupthink is basically when the group starts to make irrational or not so great decisions because they start prioritizing harmony amongst the group members and minimizing arguments, resulting in them confirming more and more, which undermines their critical thinking. I believe that groupthink was one of the main reasons why nobody questioned the authority of the Vault computer within Vault 11. People genuinely did not want to risk breaking up the harmony of the group and potentially risk them to be voted to be a sacrifice, and therefore they just confirmed and played along to whatever most people decided to do. The different subgroups within Vault 11 started to engage in spreading rumors and slandering the members of the other groups in hopes of trying to get them nominated for sacrifice. The propaganda posters were rampant inside the Vault. For instance, this particular poster reads, "Haley is a known adulterer and a communist sympathizer. Elect Haley for overseer." And this other one reads, "I hate Nate." The groups also engage in counter-propaganda to try and improve their own perceptions and the perceptions of their own members by the other groups. For example, this particular poster asked the residents to consider Stone instead of Haley for overseer, as they believe that the rumors on Haley are baseless. And this other poster tries to appeal to the humanity of the residents, trying to say that Glover's family needs him and therefore should not be chosen to sacrifice. These propaganda posters clearly reiterate my point that while there are a lot of difference between the subgroups, the overarching Vault group still tries to play on the Cold War era American values, as that's the sort of culture the residents were exposed to prior to the nuclear war. We can see this unfold in the real world as well, especially in politics, where we all separate ourselves based on different affiliations to different political parties, which all obviously have very different values. We still have some core shared values, such as humanity, protecting the environment, and political parties often tries to appease to these shared values in order to gain more support, especially from members of the other parties, or to sway the members of the other parties into joining their own. A group known as Justice Bloc became the largest group by numbers within the Vault, and as it started to gain more and more members, the leaders of this group started to become more and more cocky. They realized that no one from the Justice Bloc would be sacrificed until every single member of the other groups have been fully sacrificed, because they have the voting majority. Power corrupts, and this enabled the leaders of the Justice Bloc to start engaging in corrupt practices and try to manipulate votes. They decided to nominate one Nathan Stone for sacrifice purely because he kept beating them at poker. They also ended up doing unspeakable things to his wife Catherine, promising to save her husband, but they never withdrew their nomination. Because Catherine was severely traumatized by the leaders of the Justice Bloc, she decided to enact her revenge by killing some of the Justice Bloc members, and then subsequently admitting to the killings so that she can be elected the overseer. She knew full well that she would be sacrificed if she admits to the killings. She was ready to die. However, she also knew that most of the residents had forgotten by this point in time that the overseer gets to control the Vault computer. The moment she became an overseer, she issued an order to the computer to select a resident at random to sacrifice each year, effectively making the elections redundant. Obviously, discussing to make a decision to sacrifice people at random would not have worked well if it was discussed within the group members, because it puts everyone at equal odds for becoming a sacrifice, while with the electoral system, most people would have tended to overestimate their individual odds for survival. Given the extent of trauma Catherine had to undergo, she was ready to be sacrificed, and she took an authoritative decision to make the process fair for all, completely disregarding any opinions or repercussions she would have faced socially from her group members. The dissolution of the election also means that the position of power which the Justice Bloc established for themselves is also no longer relevant. Because they were desperate to regain the lost power, some of the Justice Bloc members decided to start an armed rebellion to take authority by force. However, given the redundance of the groups, we can start to see all the residents question each other's idea more so than they did before.
She can't do this. It's done. We're done. Nothing's done. She's got the authority. The only thing she can't do is change her own fate. Nothing says she can't change the selection process for future overseers. I say she can't. You shouldn't have toyed with her like that, Roy. We still have the majority. We don't vote for anything anymore. I'm not talking about voting. What then? You want to have a sit-in? A hunger strike? Not exactly. Maybe march into her office with torches and pitchforks? Yes. Come on. I mean it. What? Start a revolution? Laws don't outlast their governments. Roy, all we have to do is wait until someone from Justice Block gets picked for overseer. Then we have them change the law back. There won't be any blocks after the new overseer is picked tomorrow. Everyone's going to move on. By the time we've reformed, who knows if we'll still be in the majority? We can hold the block together. You don't know that. Besides, what if the computer picks you? What if it picks me? And your solution is to start shooting? Not if we don't have to. Look, we arm up. We go to the lower floors, take some strategic targets. Power, food, water, just until she turns authority over to us. The other blocks won't support it. They're tired of us having the power. We have the majority. We don't need them. This isn't a vote, Roy. They'll fight back. They've never had the nerve. Hell of a way to test it.
The Justice Bloc ended up taking up arms anyway, resulting in a major armed conflict within the walls across all members. The fighting did not last long though, because it killed almost everybody except for 5 residents. The 5 survivors of this civil war decided then to stop fighting and reflect on what had happened. Realizing the bloodshed and that most of their loved ones have been tragically lost because of the elections and the greed of the other residents and themselves, they decided to accept the alternative and be exterminated together by the computer. They did not want to kill each other or to die sporadically over the next 5 years.
Alright, I know you can hear me, so listen up. There's 5 of us left. 5 out of I don't know how many. So, it's over. We've talked and it's over. We're not gonna send anybody to die anymore. So shut off our water, our gases, or do whatever it is you're programmed to do. But we're done listening to you.
However, to their extreme surprise, they finally saw the debrief message.
Congratulations, citizens of Vault 11. You have made the decision not to sacrifice one of your own. You can walk with your head held high, knowing that your commitment to human life is a shining example to us all. And to make that feeling of pride even sweeter, I have some exciting news. Despite what you were led to believe, the population of Vault 11 is not going to be exterminated for its disobedience. Instead, the mechanism to open the main vault door has now been enabled, and you can come and go at your leisure, but not so fast. Be sure to check with your overseer to find out if it's safe to leave. Here at Vault-Tec, your safety is our #1 priority.
They were truly, utterly, intensely horrified. 17 years of elections to sacrifice a fellow resident for no reason whatsoever. A civil war due to people's greed and desire for power. Witnessing every single person they've known for the last 17 years die tragically. Some very likely in their own hands during the Civil War. That's enough trauma for several lifetimes. Looking at the tone of the voice they had after discussing with the computer, it was clear that these guys were extremely ridden with guilt. They further discussed the idea of ending everything, coming to an understanding that they do not deserve to live. However, not all survivors shared the same opinion. One of them was very hesitant and wanted to share the story to the other survivors outside, if at all there are any. Groupthink struck again, because the other 4 members from this survivor group started to come to similar conclusions even though their view on the situation was drastically different. One survivor believed that they did what they were supposed to do and that anyone else would have done the same if they were in the same circumstance. However, this person was immediately dissuaded by another survivor, who said that this is exactly the reason why they should commit this shared act. The hesitant survivor started to realize that these guys are going to carry out this act regardless of how much he tries to convince them otherwise.
Are we really gonna do this? It's open. We could just leave.
I couldn't. Not after that.
We don't deserve to leave.
A shining example. That's what it called us. But we were. We did what we were supposed to. Not by a long shot. Anybody would have done what we did.
You ask me? That's exactly the problem. Now let's get on with this.
I'll go first.
Wait. People should know what happened.
They could learn from it. If there's anyone out there at all, I hope they never have to find out. Ready, Harry? Yeah. No, wait!
It's truly tragic. Based on the final voice recording from the vault, we can clearly see that one of the survivors were trying to turn their gun against the person that was trying to convince everybody else. And this person, in a last resort of self-defense, ended up killing every other vault member, leaving him the lone survivor of Vault 11.